This film is based on a true story. Events take place in Cambridge in 1961. Two students, Stephen and Brian, goof around, racing their bicycles. When the friends get tired, they go into a bar, continuing to discuss physics. Soon Stephen was spotted by a beautiful girl named Jane. A conversation ensued between the young people. It turned out that Jane was studying French and Spanish art, and Stephen was studying cosmology. The conversation continued on the stairs. Jane is religious, unlike Stephen, who believes that the structure of the universe can be explained by science. Before leaving, Jane left Stephen her phone number. At university, students were given 10 difficult assignments each to see who was good for what. One day, while hanging out with friends at a bar, Stephen noticed Jane. She was offended because he didn't call her. In spite of this, Stephen hoped to see her. Brian questioned his friend about how many tasks he had solved. It turned out that he hadn't even started yet, because he liked to sleep. But overcoming his laziness, Stephen decided to start the task. He was late for class. The professor was amazed when he saw that Stephen had solved 9 out of 10 assignments. Later, the professor decided to discuss the topic of his doctoral dissertation with the student, but he has no ideas yet. The professor gave him a tour of the laboratory where several great scientists made their discoveries. Next Friday, the professor is going to go to London to meet a famous mathematician. Stephen is invited to go with him. In the afternoon, Stephen met Jane, who was coming from a church service. He invited her to have lunch with his family. Jane wondered why Stephen did not believe in God. In his opinion, a divine creator should not interfere with mathematical calculations. On Friday, Jane attended a ball in London with Stephen. When the lights went out, the white men's shirts seemed to light up. Stephen explained that this was due to the washing powder, which fluoresces to absorb ultraviolet light. After the dancing, there were fireworks to celebrate. Then the party continued. Jane told that she had decided to do medieval art because she liked to travel through time. Once the two of them were left on the bridge, the young people began dancing and kissing. The next morning, Jane found a package of that very same washing powder under her door. Stephen was late for his train because he suddenly found it harder to keep his coordination of movements. In class, the professor talked about black holes, the center of which is a singularity, where space and time collapse. On the way back, Stephen couldn't stop thinking about what he had heard at the lecture. Later, he shared his insights with Jane. According to Stephen, the collapse theory could be applied to the entire universe. Perhaps if the arrow of time were reversed, the universe would be a singularity. The instructor found the idea interesting. He advised Stephen to find a solid mathematical foundation for his theory. That's what the young man was doing in his spare time. But one day on the street, he suddenly couldn't walk and fell. Stephen underwent several medical examinations and tests. Sitting in the bathtub, Stephen realized that his arms and legs no longer obeyed him. The doctor diagnosed him with a myotrophic lateral sclerosis. It is a progressive neurological disorder in which muscles slowly deteriorate. According to the doctor, Stephen has a maximum of 2 years to live. Unfortunately, the disease is incurable, but it does not affect the brain itself. Brian, as always, was joking and full of positivity, but when Stephen told him about his terrible diagnosis, he couldn't believe it. Now Stephen wanted to be alone and asked Brian to leave him alone. The mother informed her son that Jane had called him, but he did not want to answer the phone. Later, the girl came to the campus, but Stephen wouldn't answer the door. Then Brian told her what was going on. No matter what, Jane came to Stephen. He tried to chase her away, but the girl forced him to get up and play croquet with her. Being stubborn, Stephen agreed to it. Any action was very difficult for him. It was painful for Jane to watch it, and she could not hold back her tears. Stephen went to his room and tried to convince her to leave him alone. But Jane said she loved him, and they would be together as long as they were meant to be. That day, Stephen informed the professor that he had chosen the topic of his dissertation, time. In the evening, Jane comes to talk to Stephen's father. Frank asks Jane to understand that it will be very hard for her if she stays. Although Jane does not look like a strong person, she loves Stephen very much. They will all fight the disease together. Soon the couple were married, and later they had a child. Stephen found it increasingly difficult to walk and talk, but he attended classes at the university. Today the committee is ready to give its verdict on his dissertation. According to the professors, this is an outstanding theory. Stephen will now receive his degree. Most of all, he wants to prove with a single equation that time has a beginning. In the evening, Stephen celebrates with family and friends. He finds it increasingly difficult to perform any action, even holding cutlery. After excusing himself, Stephen tries to climb the stairs to the second floor. From above, his young son Robert looks up at him. In the morning, Jane brought out the wheelchair she had bought. Stephen really didn't want to use a wheelchair, but he had no choice. His wife supports him. Before going to bed, despite Stephen's illness, they make love. Soon the couple had a daughter, Lucy. As Jane was helping her husband put on his sweater, the baby cried. Jane had to go to baby, while Stephen looked at the fireplace through the fabric of his sweater and imagined a black hole. This gave him a new idea. In the morning, Jane drove her husband to the university, where they were met by Professor Dennis. Stephen spoke before some of the most respected scientists in the world. According to Stephen, a black hole is not really black at all. Individual elementary particles can burst out of it, and this leads to a loss of black hole mass. Over time it disappears. Brian told this theory to the rest of his university friends. Everyone was delighted, because Stephen had managed to prove that time has a beginning. Some professors called it absurd and left the audience. Suddenly Professor Kalatnikov from the USSR Academy of Sciences, who studies the properties of microwave relic radiation, stood up. According to Kalatnikov, Stephen Hawking's theory is evolutionary. The professors began to applaud Stephen. Looking at this, Jane was very proud of him. In the evening the friends celebrated the occasion. Taking a drunken Stephen in his arms, Brian asked if his illness was affecting his intimate life. He replied that it did not. As time went on, articles about Hawking's radiation began to appear in respected scientific journals. Jane and the children surprised Stephen with an electric wheelchair. Stephen continued to develop his theory, exchanging ideas with professors. Jane, meanwhile, was trying to concentrate on her own thesis on medieval art, but she found it difficult to do so at home. Stephen and his family visited his parents. Jane was finding it increasingly difficult to cope. She looked tired at the family dinner. Suddenly Stephen choked. His parents were confused, but Jane already knew what to do. As she walked away, she cried softly. On the way back she confided to her husband that it was very hard for her to cope with it all alone. If it weren't for their eldest son Robert, she wouldn't be able to do anything at all. Because of that, the boy has no childhood. At home, noticing her daughter's nervous state, her mother advised her to join a church choir. That way she could relieve her stress. The daughter was skeptical about the idea, but decided to try. At first she just watched from the sidelines, and after class she met Jonathan, the leader of the church choir. Jane said that her husband also loved music and that her son would like to take piano lessons. When Stephen returned home after work, he was not too happy to see a strange man in the house. Jane invited Jonathan to stay for dinner. He acted very friendly and asked about Hawking's radiation, proving that time has a beginning. With the help of Jane, Stephen said that his new theory partly disproves this idea. Now Stephen wants to prove that the universe has no limits at all. No limits, no beginning, and there is no God. Stephen dreams of deriving a single form that unites all four fundamental interactions in the universe. After dinner Stephen and Jonathan talked privately. Jonathan told that he had also been married, but that his wife had died of leukemia. Music helped him cope with his depression. After thanking Jane and Stephen for the evening, Jonathan was about to leave. He said he would be glad to do something for their family. Before going to bed, Stephen told his wife that he understands. If she needed help, and if someone was willing to provide it, he wouldn't mind. That was exactly what Jane needed right now. Since then, Jonathan became a good friend of the family. They spent a lot of time together and life became easier. Brian also remained a loyal friend to Stephen. Jane began to sing in the church choir after all. After lessons, she told Jonathan that she was pregnant. She and Stephen will have a third child. Soon a boy was born, named Tim. The family was celebrating the event, and Jonathan was also present. The father advised Stephen to hire a good nurse, because Jonathan was clearly becoming involved in their family. Stephen's mother also expressed her doubts and demanded that Jane answer who Tim's father really was. Upon hearing this accusation, Jane was outraged. Jonathan, who witnessed this conversation, wanted to leave, but Jane asked him to stay. They love each other, but Jane has never cheated on her husband. And Jonathan is only helping their family because he really wants to. Later at home, Stephen informed his wife that he was invited to the Opera House in Bordeaux. He would go there with his students, and Jane, who does not like to fly by plane, could go with the children and Jonathan by car. Stephen decides to talk to his friend and visits him at church with a beer. Even though Stephen's parents are against it, he wants Jonathan to remain a friend of their family and accompany Jane and the children to Bordeaux. The family was getting ready to leave. Stephen left first, and his wife followed with Jonathan and the older children. They camped out for the night to spend time outdoors. The students helped the professor to a seat in the hall. Meanwhile, Jane, having waited until the children were asleep, came to Jonathan's tent. Suddenly, during the opera, Stephen became ill. The people around him immediately began to give him first aid. The next morning, Jane found out what had happened. She and Jonathan rushed to the hospital in Bordeaux, and on the way Jane was very worried. Stephen was lying on a ventilator. The doctors wanted to turn off the life support machine so that Stephen would not suffer. Otherwise they would have to perform a tracheotomy, but then Stephen would never speak again. Jane adamantly refused to consent to the ventilator being turned off and said that Stephen would live at any cost. Jonathan said goodbye to Jane, who was going to transfer Stephen by plane back to Cambridge. The operation was very complicated. Jane was waiting in the corridor for news. Stephen was able to wake up from the anesthesia after all. Now he doesn't talk and is in rehab. Jane brought a magnetic board with letters to try to communicate with him. Stephen has to blink when his wife says the right letter, but he ignored her attempts. They both cried with impotence. Jane hired a nurse after all. Her name is Elaine and she has Elaine at references. Elaine gave the impression of being a very energetic and intelligent woman. She immediately found common ground with Stephen. In the evening, Elaine told Jane that she was very lucky because Stephen is a very smart and funny person. Soon the family was given a wheelchair with a computer that would allow to type words and convert them into speech. It should make their lives a lot easier. Gradually Stephen got the hang of using the computer. He and Elaine spent a lot of time together. And one evening Stephen told his wife that he would write a book about the nature of time. From that day on, his work on the book began. One day Elaine was going through Stephen's mail and found a magazine with explicit photographs in it. Elaine told the professor that he didn't have to be ashamed of her. Stephen decided to call his book A Brief History of Time. Soon Stephen was sent a contract from the publisher. Jane noticed that Elaine and Stephen had become very close. When Jane saw a draft of the forthcoming book, she was shocked when she read the mention of God there. Suddenly Stephen told his wife that he had asked Elaine to accompany him to America for the award ceremony. There she would look after him. Jane realized that their marriage had come to an end. Doctors gave Stephen only 2 years to live, but he is still alive. And now Stephen wants to let go of his wife to give her a chance to live for herself. She had done all she could for him and deserved some personal happiness. Stephen was about to move out of their house. Soon Jane visited Jonathan at the church. Now they could be together. The book A Brief History of Time became an international bestseller. Dennis told the audience about a colleague and friend whose entire life became a continuous struggle. Against all odds, he became a great scientist. Elaine was among the invited guests. Stephen answered questions from the audience from the stage. All people were interested not only in his theory, but also in his life. Seeing the pen that had fallen from the table, Stephen began to imagine in his mind that he got up from his wheelchair and picked it up. When an audience member asked what religious philosophy Stephen Hawking relies on, he replied that the universe is something that lies beyond human understanding. But there should be no limit to man's endeavors. As long as there is life, there is hope. People began to give a standing ovation. Soon Jane received a letter from Stephen, whom the Queen of Great Britain wanted to knight. Of course Jane and the children were also invited. After the award, Stephen and Jane looked at their children. This is the miracle they have created together. Next, the voiceover tells us about the real Stephen Hawking, who at the time of the film's release was 72 years old.